for coming back to CenterFrame Interviews, where we host fantastic filmmakers from all around the world. And today I'm very, very glad to host Syrian filmmaker Rana Kazkaz. She's a resident lecturer at Northwestern University in Qatar and has recently had a feature film called The Translator out on release, which I really want to congratulate you for. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you, Bernhard.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've spoken previously, because it's basically when we had a couple of discussions sort of joining the CenterFrame community and what it would be and who would be part of this team and which filmmakers are we talking about, what are we talking about. And just before we got started on this very call, we talked about collaboration and how much of a learning curve that is and how much of a learning curve it is for your students to deal with this. So it's really cool that you're actually part of the community, and I'm so glad to talk to you about your films, because I really, while I haven't seen The Translator, of course I have seen Nostrum, and what I would like to get started before we delve into your films themselves, I would like to discuss what it's like to be an expatriate, to have left your home country, and also to be sort of multi-identity, and tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what your family life was like, and how that brought you into filmmaking.
Thank you for that question. So I wrote a paper that was called Refugee Status Privileged, because my mom is actually American, my dad is Syrian, and I was born in France. I held American and French citizenship. So when the Syrian revolution started in March 2011, and I was living there, I was living in Damascus, and even though I supported the movement that was happening, the peaceful movement that was happening, the protesters, when it got violent and I became very afraid, I had the privilege of leaving when I wanted to, and I wasn't one of the refugees who had to risk their life crossing the Mediterranean Sea on an ill-equipped boat, being overcharged, having the Greek or the Italian or other pirates come by and try to sink your boat.
Yeah.
I didn't have to throw over my possessions overboard in the hopes that it would stop the boat from sinking. I didn't have to make a 3-month journey on foot across Europe, being starving, being kicked, traveling from truck to car to train, whatever would have you, to then hopefully, think that I might be able to find asylum somewhere in Europe. I mean, I didn't have to do any of that. Not to say that there aren't other traumas that sort of, come in the way, but yeah, no. So I'm very privileged. I think what's sad, it's very sad to think that we will likely never go back to Syria.
Right.
That's very sad to think about. We miss it, but it's not safe to return, and it doesn't look like the current power structure is going anywhere.
Right, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's always the sort of the big question when you have a country of upheaval is it still the home that you came to and the home that you left behind? And you said you had multiple homes. You obviously grew up in multiple places. So what is it like shifting home from place to place in your youth, and where do you draw inspiration from in your storytelling?
So, I grew up in a multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual home. I grew up moving around a lot, different countries. So I think it's just part of me. I think when I don't move for a while, I start to get itchy.
Yeah.
So the fact that I have to change residence or move doesn't feel unfamiliar to me, right? I think in the case of Syria, just what happened was the awareness of the death and destruction and the cruelty, not just that was being played out from within the country, but externally, this sort of hypocritical awareness that I developed of the politics of language and geopolitics and money and the war machine. That all became something that was very dark. That was a very dark place to see that that's by and large the way our world works at the power level.
Right, of course. What was you didn't grow up in Syria, so how does your perspective, where does your perspective come from back then when you didn't grow up there? Like, what was your perspective of
Yeah.
Syria like as a child?
So as I said, I was born in France, and then we moved to the United States after France, and I lived in Algeria. Then we went back to the United States, and it was when we went back to the United States after having lived in Algeria. I was 11 years old. It was 1982, and there was a massacre in the town of Hama, which is in the north of Syria, which is where most of my family was living. It's where my dad's side of the family is from. And so, although I didn't understand what was happening at 11 years old on a political level, I did understand that there were family members that had been killed. I understand that it was the Syrian government that had done it to its own citizens. I understood that there were geopolitical relationships between Syria and Iran, and internally between the various political parties that were all part of it. That religion was a part of it. But how I absorbed it, I think at that time, was just this sense of fragility, that people you love and care about could be hurt in that way. And so I think that was really formative for me. As it is, I imagine, for anybody, that level of violence, whether it's government inflicted or if it's domestic, or if it's from a different, whatever that source of violence is, it's often formative for us.
Absolutely. How did that inspire you to then make your short film Mare Nostrum? Obviously, you also have a collaborator in this, so it's not just you on your own, but you both have a very direct connection to this story. So tell me about Mare Nostrum, what its story is, and also how you got to telling that story.
My husband Enes and I, who co-directed Mare Nostrum, we were co-directing around 2014. We were co-directing a documentary about Syrian refugees living in Jordan. And the hope was to take them through an acting workshop that then would allow them to perhaps be actors in our feature film, The Translator, which is the one that just came out. So this documentary was called Searching for the Translator. We had, these were non-actors, and it was remarkable to see them, build this sort of acting community, do all of these bizarre acting exercises together, talk about their own fears, talk about their courage, et cetera, et cetera. But one moment the cameras were off and we were just all eating lunch together. And the conversation turned to who was thinking about risking their life to cross the sea, and who could swim.
Right.
And who's, how much, did they have enough money? Et cetera, et cetera. So there was a cast of 12, and 3 of the 12 actually took the boats.
Amazing.
Horrible stories of crossing, but they all survived. So that was one thing that happened, is that I knew people, right? And these were architects, one was a writer, et cetera. One was a journalist, you know what I mean? These were not, what is often thought of as some sort of refugee, that this is, not an uneducated person, right?
Yeah.
However it is that we, miscategorize what a refugee is.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened. Another thing that happened was that I was with a group of my own friends. And I was shocked to hear sort of the rhetoric that was coming out of their mouths about, how dare these refugees try to cross? They're being selfish. They just need to stay where they are. The world, sort of demonizing the person that would make that decision. And for me, I internalized that as hatred. And then that particular night, I came home and turned on the news, and it was one of the stories where about 800 people had crossed and had been suspected of drowning that day. And the Mare Nostrum started to materialize in my mind at that moment. One was to give the audience this idea of what it would mean to hate this character of the father so much.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to embrace that hatred of him. And then hopefully by the end, the audience would be taken on a journey in which that hatred would then transition into actually realizing that everything he did was an act of love and sacrifice. And hopefully that it also required looking in the mirror for the audience to maybe, wonder why they had judged a refugee so harshly.
Yeah. No, I found the for anybody who hasn't watched the film, the premise is very, very straightforward. Basically, a father is trying to teach the daughter to swim because they're about to cross, and he himself can't swim. He doesn't know how to do it, and he doesn't know how to teach how to swim either, but he's trying to get his daughter to swim in order to be able to survive the possible journey, something that he might not be able to do, but something he could give to his daughter. It's probably the last thing he could give to his daughter is that, I found the storytelling really, really compelling. It really left it it's almost entirely without dialogue. Yes, there's dialogue, but it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to understand a single word in order to get what the movie is. I think that's really, really strong storytelling there. What I found interesting is you mentioned your father as well, having being your eye on Syrian life, and this being also a father-daughter story. I was wondering if you could talk about your relationship with your father and how that influenced this story, maybe.
Bernhard, this question you're asking is actually the first time I'm asking it of myself. And I want to thank you for bringing this extra layer of analysis to me personally. So, in figuring out the dynamic and who these characters would be in the film, there was a lot of tug of war in my head. Is it a father-son story? Is it a mother-son story? Is it a mother-daughter story? And why, in the end, the father-daughter story became the most compelling? Because out of all the four combinations, to my mind anyway, it felt the most vulnerable.
I can see that. I think it's also like there's this thing about father-daughter stories, which isn't obviously universal. Everybody has sort of their own experiences, but at least from what I can tell, there seems to be this hyper-protective bond between a father and his daughter. It's like the father feels even more obligated to protect the daughter than he would a son. The son he maybe have to teach, but the daughter, there's a certain expectance of self-reliance coming from a father to a son, whereas, the father doesn't necessarily expect that by default. He needs to make sure she's okay, and I do think there's a stronger bond there that fathers and daughters have. So that's why I wanted to ask you what if you were able to draw from your parental relationship in writing this.
You're making me aware that there's a reason why that relationship felt the most vulnerable. And I think that was the relationship that I felt was the most vulnerable in my personal life, was the relationship I had with my dad. Absolutely. And so I thank you for, like I said, bringing that awareness to me. And now I'm going to have to talk to my dad about it, of course.
Oh, well. Is there, do you see any kind of um, obviously it is his act in the film is an act of desperation.
Yeah.
And can you point to something that you would have seen, even if it's not in your own parental life, that you would go, if you had to teach somebody to swim, how do you do it, and how desperate would you have to be? I don't know. I'm just trying to wonder if there's something more than that.
So it's so on the subject of the way it was depicted, the way he chose to teach
Yeah.
his daughter to swim / survive. It's interesting because of the reactions that come from that. So on the one hand, there are people saying, well, why couldn't he have done it in a more gentle way, right? Because, for example, there's this inciting incident where we see that another father is sort of like peacefully sitting while his
Yeah.
daughter is swimming in front of him, right? Which is a juxtaposition to this other father-daughter relationship, right? So I get that question. And my answer is usually that, well, that sounds really pleasant and kind, doesn't it? To be able to have the peace of mind and the confidence of knowing that you know how to swim, and that you're not worried about whether or not you're going to eat, and that survive the water isn't a place of survival, but to survive, but it's a place for pleasure.
Yeah.
Right. And so so what that says to me is that people are still trying to insist that there can be kindness in this moment, and actually there's nothing kind about the situation that the father and daughter are in. It's horrific.
Yeah.
It's horrific, the place they're in. So number one, there's nothing kind about it, so why depict it in that way? And then two, there was, of course, this peeling of the onion, which is, you don't know why he's teaching her the way he's teaching her, but then we realize, well, he can't swim himself, so he doesn't even know what he's teaching.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so there's that reaction. And then there's another reaction that I've had many times from men and women saying, that's how my dad taught me to swim. He just threw me in the water.
Yeah, effectively, it's a lovely metaphor for what refugees were being asked to do. They were basically being asked to survive by being thrown in the deep end. You know what I mean? Like it's literally the expression. You throw them into the deep end and then hope they'll swim. And
Yeah.
I think it's a great metaphor for what refugees have to go through. It's not like you can train to be a refugee, like that's just not possible. You become one and you survive with whatever you've got. That's it, end of story. And either you find someone that can help you or you don't. And more often than not you are reliant on whatever's immediately around you, and that's pretty much it. There is no higher resource that can somebody swoop in and help you. It's certainly not a guarantee of it. And that's why I found the metaphor to be so strong. But you do make an interesting narrative decision at the end where you change from what is, it's not necessarily a fictional story in the sense that you are documenting potentially real behavior. This may have really happened in exactly this manner, but you do very actively shift to a documentary moment at the end of the story.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what the decision was behind that to shift narrative in a way.
Yeah. So this is often, if there is criticism of the film, this is often the thing that is criticized is, well, there's two things that are criticized. One is that the audience sometimes never gets beyond their hatred of the father.
Yeah.
And they can't get beyond it. The second thing was, as you said, sort of changing genres. So it's actually not documentary at the end, it's docufiction.
Yeah.
So that's not a real news report.
Oh, is it not? Okay.
No.
Right.
So that's something I wrote, and those are images that were culled together from several different AP voyages.
Right.
That
Okay.
we edited together. But what's interesting is that how many times I heard after people watched the film saying, oh my gosh, I remember that news story.
Right. Okay.
Now I love that people say that, because that says to me it's somewhere in the collective, right? And yet it speaks to exactly why I made the choice to have it end the way it did, which is that when we hear these journalistic reports, we don't really hear them or internalize them, do we? You know what I mean? I mean, sometimes something can be really powerful and we'll react to it in a really emotional or memorable way. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes it just feels like news and numbers.
Yeah.
It feels like facts. And so that was also meant to sort of juxtapose like this silent majority of the film in the beginning, where, like you said, there's no dialogue, right? And yet at the end, all we hear are words and we see images. And the hope was that the next time that we heard such a story, this kind of journalistic piece, that we would think more about the decision that people had to make before they got in the boat.
Yeah.
You know, that's the other thing, is that I think sometimes there's this impression that's like, there's like a kiosk and you line up and you buy your ticket. You know what I mean? And then
yeah.
you pay on your credit card and you get on one of these dinghies, right? And of course, that's not at all what happens. It's absolutely traumatizing. And like I said, when we were, making this documentary with the Syrian refugees and, the people listening to them debate, like the debate was traumatizing. Just the fact that it was in here and they had to think about whether or not they would do it. Like, that's horrible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very, I'm not sure delicate is the right word specifically, but it's a very nuanced realization of that story and that world. And I think because you're not being so, and the most overt piece is the very end, but because I thought that was a real news report that you decided to fictionalize, it's like, so this is the one story that's happened to this person and you told what the real story of that person is. I thought that's what you did, but by fictionalizing the news report, that has to me a whole nother layer to it, which I thought was very very interesting. It also speaks to just how dangerous it is to just believe the news report, as a source of facts, that
good point.
That how easy it is to basically manipulate a viewer into thinking that what they just saw was real, and the news unfortunately use this a lot, as part of their techniques and their tactics. This brings me to a bit of a question. Where do you go? I mean, you mentioned that there's already the link between the translator because you made the documentary and the film. Now, how did you get to the translator from here? Like, what was the inspiration to tell the translator? Tell me a little bit about the premise of the translator for people who don't know it, but also how you got to the translator.
Thank you. So, the translator is currently distributed. Depending on the region you're in, you can see it on a different number of platforms. But this was a project that I started writing in 2011 on the heels of the eruption of the Syrian revolution in March 2011, of course, which was, part of the larger Arab Spring movement that had already, been met in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, etc. And I had always considered myself to be an activist. I remember, my mother taking me door to door, even when I was a child, seeking the Equal Rights Amendment for women, etc. And so I knew and felt comfortable in my activism. And then when the peaceful protesters started to go out into the streets in Damascus, I suddenly had a fear in me that I had never had before. Yes, my children were little, but I know plenty of mothers with children who also risk their lives going out in the streets. So I don't think that's an excuse. It's just that we were different people. And like I said earlier, I was privileged in that, unlike a lot of my family and friends who were living in Syria, I had a passport that allowed me to leave whenever I wanted. So I did leave, and I was haunted by leaving. I was haunted by the fact that I did nothing, and I was, and those two things sort of became what would be the story of the translator that NS and I started to develop. So the story is about a man named Sammy who was working as an Arabic English translator in Sydney, Australia. Why is he in Sydney, Australia? Because in the year 2000, during the Olympics that were taking place there, he was the translator for the Syrian Olympic team. And while translating for an athlete, he makes a slip of the tongue, which indicates his lack of support for the Assad regime. So
Right.
for fear of what would happen to him if he were to go back, he has been living in exile in Sydney. So in 2011, when the Arab Spring starts, he's an Arabic English translator. So of course he's translating the videos coming through from the citizen journalists in Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. And surprisingly, shockingly, it starts in Syria, and he receives a video in which he sees his brother being kidnapped by the government, arrested for having participated in a peaceful demonstration. So haunted by the fact that he abandoned his family, and haunted by the fact that unlike his brother and his father, who are activists, he illegally smuggles himself back into Syria in order to find his brother. But what he needs is to find his voice.
Yeah, of course.
So as a translator, he can no longer hide behind the words of others. He must eventually say what he stands for. You know,
And so he travels to Syria in order to find his brother, basically.
Yes.
Right. So where did you film most of the translator? Because obviously, I doubt you filmed in Syria. So what did you choose to reproduce? I'm assuming Damascus and or where did you
Yep.
decide to film?
So we had shot the documentary Searching for the Translator in Jordan, which was where we were living.
Right.
And then we shot Nostrum, also in Jordan, which was where
Right.
we were living. And so we had a good experience shooting there with those two films. So we just thought that was the right place to go back. So we actually shot in Jordan and then also Australia.
Right. Fantastic. And how long did you film for?
Oh, production
Yeah.
was almost 2 months. It was over a
Right.
2 month period. I think we had 33 days.
Okay, but
Over
that's
a
good though.
2 month
That's
period.
a good schedule. That's a really solid schedule. I like that.
We needed like 3 more days. But we always say that, don't we?
There's never enough time. There's never enough money. You know, it's like I seriously.
Of course.
Seriously, I've with every film I've ever done, there's never enough time, never enough money. I don't know why that's the case. I don't know why we can't just have a shoot where you just don't run into these issues. You know, it's so funny. It's like we always do.
Well, it's interesting you say that because that's always been my experience too, right? With all these movies, you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money. With Mare Nostrum, we had enough time and enough money.
Amazing. What was your budget on Mare Nostrum?
There's probably somebody that'll be upset that I'll say it out loud. I think it was $80,000.
Nice. That's good. That's a great budget.
It's a great budget, you know.
That's a fantastic budget for a
You
short
could
film.
feed the crew well. People slept well. We had enough days to film, and the atmosphere was really. I mean, it was such a tough subject, but it was such a great atmosphere while filming. We just had a lovely time together.
What was it? Actually, since we're coming back to Mare Nostrum, and I do recommend you watch the translator since it's out in release. Have a look. Definitely check it out. It's worth doing. But let's come back to Mare Nostrum because you did something that is generally sort of recommended against, which is you film with kids. And how old was the girl?
She had just turned 7, and she was my daughter.
Oh,
She's
is
my
that your
daughter.
daughter? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So not just did you decide to choose to film with a child, you chose to film with your daughter as well.
And not initially. We cast another girl first.
Right. But
so my daughter didn't want to do it.
right.
So we held auditions, and we casted another girl, lovely, But then we brought Ziad Bakri, who's playing the father, to come meet her. And they had no chemistry.
Oh, no.
And Enes and I looked at each other and we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Like, she doesn't even want anything to do with him. Meanwhile, my daughter's teasing him, jumping all over him.
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They got on like gangbusters. And so that evening, Enes and I were like, we need to talk to Zaza,
Right.
Zayn, our daughter. And we said, Zaza, we're thinking we'd really love for you to play this role. And she said, I'd really love to.
Oh, so now that she is there. Okay. So what was it like directing your daughter? Like, how did she feel about, because obviously suddenly, I mean, playing pretend is not unusual for kids, but suddenly there's a bit more than just playing pretend. You have to play pretend over and over again. So what was that like to direct your daughter like that? And what was it like for her?
Well, I mean, to her credit, I mean, she's a natural. There were a lot of things that she just kind of knew instinctively to do. Like, she knew not to look at the camera. She knew to be natural. You know what I mean?
Nice.
Like, those things she knew how to do. But what we did do to help her prepare was, you go through this as any actor does, right? You think about what you have in common with this character, like where's the place where you could start to know who this person is, and then what is it that you have that's not in common, like how are you different, so that you understand the work that you need to do. So we talked about the fact that, okay, these characters are both Syrian, they're both 6 years old, they both had to leave Syria, but our daughter has a passport that allowed her to leave easily. Her family wasn't poor. And she knew how to swim.
Right.
Right.
Oh,
like
my
those were the
God.
things that were different. Right. And she loved to swim. So we actually had to rehearse drowning.
My gosh.
So, and this is where an interesting mistake happened on my part, which was that when I would take her to rehearse drowning, we did it in a swimming pool with her bathing suit on.
Of course.
And then suddenly we went to go film, and she was now in the sea wearing clothes, which is not the same thing at all.
Of course not. So how did she react to that? Like, what was her sort of first reaction to being in the sea with clothes as opposed to in the pool?
Yeah, she was angry. She was like, why didn't you, like, I didn't know this was going to be like this. And I said, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. Let's get in. So then we went back into the swimming pool.
Right. Interesting.
And then we transitioned back into the sea.
That's interesting. So did you? I mean, the number one rule of stunt sequences is that the take where you hurt yourself is the one you use. Did you use her panicky, angry take?
So this is but you're touching on something that is so important, which is that directing and acting is an act of manipulation.
It is, absolutely.
And I was so aware that not only was, directing her, but I'm her mother, right? So the only thing I knew how to do, and I'm not sure if this was the right thing to do or not, but we would sit and analyze and sort of process and talk through everything that was happening as it was happening. For example, I'll give you an example of manipulation. So there's the scene where she has to lie in bed and she's crying.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the makeup artist said, well, I have this, usually what we do on sets is, we put this mint, there's like a mint cream, safe, like non-toxic mint cream. You put it in the eyes and it makes you tear up. And my daughter said, I don't want to do that. And I said, listen, I'm going to show you. I'm going to do it myself. So they put the mint cream in my eyes and I had the tears falling down. And she started to cry for real. And she said, I really don't want to do that. I really don't want to do that. And I was like, let's roll camera.
Right. Oh my God. But hey, look, she's in the moment already.
Well, that was it. But then after we finished doing that take, I had to sit with her and I told her about, like, we walked through the whole thing and I said, so, like, we needed you to cry. And that was, like, that's why we shot that scene when you were crying with your real tears. But so, I mean, she's, again, like, I think these are really delicate, it's a delicate situation.
It is.
And
Yeah, I mean, you have to be really careful with
yeah.
kids. I mean, it's good
Yes.
that you had somebody who's really natural, because I've heard some horror stories where kids, were there and it was fine at first, and then of course when the time came for them to actually cooperate, they didn't really, and it got more and more tricky. I was lucky enough with my first feature film. There was a scene with a 4-year-old, and that was the child of the two actors who were playing the parents of the 4-year-old. So, and he totally understood the idea of doing takes over and over again and having just repeat the same thing over and over again. He really understood that that's what they were doing. Of course, sometimes he'd be too excited and he already went straight to the next line because he knew it. So he was like, he said the next thing way earlier than he should have. But both of his parents are actors, and so he himself had a very natural tendency to just be able to perform for people, and I was really lucky, and that's a really short scene. I mean, he literally had, like, all we did with him is that we played sort of like the main actor. He sort of threw around the kid a bit, played guitar with him, that kind of thing, and then handed him to the actual dad, and then they left, and that was the scene, and he always repeated his lines, and he was great for that, but obviously there's a limit to how many hours kids can be on set and that kind of thing, especially in the UK. The rules are very strict, but but it's always interesting when you have got a very natural performing kid, a kid that just really just understands, oh, so we're playing, I mean,
Yeah.
and I can play, and I think that's, if you can find that place for them, I think that's when things work well with kids. But like you
That's a
said,
very good point. Yes, it's got to be in the spirit of play. I mean, the other thing is that, you don't see it obviously in the image, but she was surrounded by people. I mean, there were scuba divers under the water with her at all time.
exactly.
I was usually right off frame in the water with her. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
so
but I
she
mean,
was never, yeah,
remember, but that's the truth of film, right? It's like the
yeah,
moment you look beyond the frame, none of that is real. I mean,
totally.
film is still, it's a fiction, it's a lie. I mean, even a documentary, it's not, it's pretend to be real. It is play. It is not supposed to be, it's supposed to invoke real feelings. It's not supposed to set a real scene. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes,
does that make sense?
good
Um,
point.
I want to just know how you've. This is going to be my last question. It's a slightly philosophical one, and then we'll wrap this up because this is a great conversation. I really enjoyed this one.
Me too.
Uh, Tell me about how you've grown as an expatriate over time with the movies that you've told, because I feel like you mentioned that you made this film made both of these films as sort of an act of as of remorse or guilt, that you didn't do more at the time, and that
Yeah.
now you've done this. And what does Syria mean to you now, and how has that evolved, and how have you grown sort of as a, is there, I can only basically talk from personal experience, leaving Austria and having moved to the US, and also having moved away from the US to the UK, has given me a special longing for the places that I know I'm not going to return to. It's unlikely I'll ever move back to the US. It's unlikely I'll ever move back to Austria, despite them not, of course, being places I couldn't move to. If I wanted to, I could go anytime. But I'm not going to go back there. I've moved beyond those places, but they reserve a special place in my heart. And I was wondering where Syria sits for you now, in that context, both in context of the stories you've told, but also in the journey that you've gone through.
Gosh, I mean, Bernhard, I feel like you're better. I feel like you've thought about this more thoroughly than I have. So maybe hearing your thoughts on that is more helpful. I miss walking through. I miss walking through the old city. I miss walking past those buildings were as old as they were and carried as much history as it had. The general friendliness of that city as well. But again, I think what it is for me is I'm so lucky, you know. And I know so many other people who weren't, who had really horrible things happen to them, really bad things. I mean, the worst that humanity can do, you know. And so I think Syria is also, it's in a way, it's a shame, it's a tragedy, it's a place of, you know, and the people who live, you know, that I still know that are still living, that I know now who are still living there, I mean, feel like it's not even a country they recognize. It's, you know, there's visibly less men. Prices are catastrophic. There's a horrible smell because the sewer systems are not working well. You don't know when you're going to have electricity and water. The collective trauma is very present, and a feeling that morality is really a challenge these days. You know, and that's what I hear from people. And so in a way, it's gone. I mean, it's, you know, rather than negotiate a future with his own citizens, you know, the government chose to have Russia come in, and they're, you know, sort of in charge right now.
They cling to power rather than preserve the nation.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yep. So would you, if given the chance to rebuild and tell a new story of Syria, would you do it?
To be part of the rebuilding of the country?
Yeah, like if there was a chance to do it, would you do it?
Well, I mean, I humbly feel like making these films is a way of trying to do that, of thinking that, you know, if that was kind of, you know, the thought behind the documentary that we made, Searching for the Translator, is that how can you put 12 Syrians who had never known each other before from different walks of life in a room together? What would the rebuilding of the country look like, you know, among them? How could they develop a way of communicating and of being tolerant and recovering from trauma? And, you know, so I mean, I think that's such another great question that you have, Bernhard, which is that, you know, I mean, I don't know if that belongs to me. I think there's other Syrians who are more rightly positioned to be part of like a more formal rebuilding. But yeah, I'll do my part.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Rana, for joining us today. I know you have lots on with your students as well, so I wish you the best of luck with the rough cuts that just came in from your students. So thank you very much for joining us. This was a great conversation. I can't wait to watch The Translator myself, actually. I've only seen the trailers of it, so I'm very, very eager to see it myself. And congratulations again on Mare Nostrum, a fantastic, fantastic short film. And regards to your partner as well, of course.
Thank you. I'll let Enes know. I want to thank you for inviting me to be a member of CenterFrame, and I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I wish you everything good.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I much appreciate it. And be sure to check out other CenterFrame interviews on centerframe.com and join us on our social media. Join the conversation on our social media, and please sign up to our newsletter to get the latest updates. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll see you again for the next interview.